Good afternoon. Welcome. Welcome to this month's Missouri Valley Sunday. My name is Eli Paul. I'm the head of the Missouri Valley Special Collections located right over there. Thank you all for coming out on a beautiful, rare, cool July, Missouri afternoon. I also want to thank our friends at Park University. Mayor Barnes is currently serving on the graduate faculty at Park University's Hoffman School of Public Affairs, and they've done a great job of helping promote this event. So we thank them for that. Just a couple things. Some of you may have seen this flyer on your seat. It's for upcoming Missouri Valley Sunday programs. The next one in August 17, will be Dr. Petra DeWitt talking about Missouri's German Americans during World War I. They didn't have the best time here. And this is one of many programs that we're doing. You may have seen in the paper yesterday the story about the Great War, the Great Read that the library and the National World War I Museum are doing in conjunction with one another, and that's one of many such World War I events that the library is doing in August and September. So please come back for that particular event. And the August calendar is out as well. Several other related events are in there, and that's available out here to pick up. Before I turn it over to the person making the formal introductions of today's speaker, I must say that my K. Barnes story is this. My wife and I moved back to my home state, Missouri, in 2001. By 2004, I was working at the National World War I Museum, and we were engaged in, you might remember, a massive bond initiative at that time. And there was a general operating bond initiative for the city of Kansas City, one for the zoo, and one for the new museum at the at the Liberty Memorial. As part of that, I got to be involved with a political campaign, and one of the things they sent me off to was a Northland, where I live, Northland, Kansas City event, in which speakers would talk about why people should vote more taxes on themselves, which was quite an interesting thing to do. The event I went to was kicked off by Mayor K. Barnes talking about why people should pass the bond initiative. I learned two things from that event in which I spoke after her. One is that Kansas City women are a political force to be reckoned with. That was the first thing. And two, never follow K. Barnes. So I don't have to do that today. She has to follow me, which is an easy act to follow. But doing our formal introductions for our speaker today will be Crosby Kemper, the executive director of the library. Crosby?
Thanks very much, Eli. I know this is really a great crowd for our Missouri Valley series, and there are two possibilities, it seems to me, to attribute that. One is Kay's charisma, which you've just heard about from Eli, and the other is you just got tired of all the good weather and had to come inside. So I want to. There are two reasons that I'm really grateful that Kay is here. I'm going to start with the first reason, and then at the end of my introduction, I'll get to the other reason. The first reason is my family has had a long history with the Pendergasts, so I'm always interested in hearing about the Pendergasts. My great grandfather W.T. Kemper ran against Pendergast candidates. I think it was Jim Reed for mayor at one point, and the front page of the Kansas City Times actually had a supposed dialogue between Jim Pendergast and my great grandfather Jim Pendergast, saying it would not be smart for you to resign from the Parks Board, to which I pointed you, he didn't say that, but that was true, and run against my candidate for mayor, you will lose. And my great-grandfather said, oh, I think I will win. He lost, and it wasn't smart of him to run against Pendergast's candidate. However, he did learn his lesson, and later he became very close to Pendergast, close enough that from Leavenworth, where Tom Pendergast was spending some vacation time, Pendergast wrote to my great-grandfather and wrote to the federal prosecutor and the judge requesting that he be let out on bail because of his ailing health and his age, and he indicated that he wanted my great-grandfather to be his parole officer. So Kay today is going to be talking about how some of the women of Kansas City helped get him into Leavenworth. My family tried to help get him out. Kay Barnes is truly, to a Kansas City audience, someone who needs no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway, right? So, she grew up in St. Joe. She went to a little night school in Lawrence. She was one of the first two women in the Jackson County legislature. Was elected to the council in 1979. She ran her own human resources firm. Mostly, of course, what we know Kay for today. And she is a person who has a strong family background in national things with her cousin Walter Cronkite, who's been called in the past the most trusted man in America. Kay could be called the most trusted woman in Kansas City because we gave to her the job of turning Kansas City's downtown in particular, but the vision of Kansas City as a place of growth and development, a place of culture and happening things. We gave her the job to turn around the vision of Kansas City that was gaining national currency, and she did. She built the Sprint Arena. She gave us the Power and Light District. And I will say there is a relationship that my family has to Kay that's similar to the relationship that we have with the Pendergast family. I voted for her as often as I possibly could. It's a landslide was needed, and maybe even more importantly than that, there is a similarity between Kay and the Pendergasts in this way, which is very important to me, and that is. Kansas City in the 20s and 30s was the most open city in America. Paris of the Plains is one way of looking at it. A place where it was really easy to get a drink is another way to look at it. And the way I look at it, and the true reason that I'm so grateful for Kay is that she made it possible for there to be 25 bars within 2 blocks of the library. And the fact that she turned around Kansas City is a footnote to that as far as I'm concerned. So, ladies and gentlemen, the former mayor and always leader of Kansas City, Kay Barnes.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here with all of you. I look out in this audience and see so many friends. So many of us who go back quite a long time, others of us who have met only more recently. So thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. I did set out on a venture about a year ago to take some courses with the idea of creating for myself a non-for-credit doctoral program. I didn't want to narrow my focus. I simply wanted to take whatever courses I could take whenever I wanted to take them. So I have so far taken 2 courses, one of which led me to prepare a research paper on the topic of civic housekeepers and more, really taking a look at the role of women in our community, particularly in the last 100 years, and focused on the 1940 elections, because as all of you know, that was truly a pivotal time in the history of this city. So I will share with you a portion of that research, and I hope you'll enjoy hearing what I came to learn. I'm also very aware that there will be some of you in this audience who know as much or more than I do about this particular topic, either because of your family history, either because of research that you yourself have done, or conversations with other people in the community. So I hope we'll have time for a few questions and discussion after I finish sharing with you part of what I learned. As once was described, the first clubs must have been women's clubs. Surely, sitting on those cold stones in the caves, some women must have said, "Girls, we should do something about the mess in here," and tying twigs together, invented the first broom. "My hair's a mess. I can't do a thing with it." And the bone on the floor became the first comb. Why not put two skins together? And the first needle and designer dress were born. And so it has gone. Whenever women came together, they formed a club, working together to improve their conditions. That's a humorous yet apropos introduction to an exploration of the role of Kansas City women and women's organizations in multiple civic reform movements, culminating in the successful 1940 anti-machine city elections. From the 1860s and into the early 1900s, in various organizations, we found women organizing, forming together whatever they could to work on community issues. It was interesting, though, because during that same period, the name Pendergast became known in Kansas City. James Pendergast, an Irish politician and hotel and bar owner, began to build a political family dynasty through providing aid to the poor. His approach was more popular because, in contrast to the benevolent associations, he required no investigations of the needy recipients before they could receive assistance. Several influential women's clubs emerged in the 1890s, two particularly prominent ones being the Athenaeum and the Women's City Club. Both continued a focus on benevolence, yet gradually expanded their activities to include civic reform efforts. For example, by 1914, Athenaeum members had appeared before the City Council and its committees arguing against prostitution and gambling, as well as lobbying against saloons in neighborhoods. A year later, as described in the Kansas City Star, the Athenaeum's, quote, social and civic committees are apt to hold up and show up anywhere and at the most disconcerting moments in municipal crises. Sometimes state officials have been driven to wonder how these women knew. Hardly a moment that does not come in some way under the eye of these women who are the most persistent of mothers and civic housekeepers. Although often ambivalent about direct political activity, in the 1930s, the leadership of the Women's City Club gradually led its membership into more active civic engagement against the Pendergast machine. Now led by Tom Pendergast, the younger brother of James, the machine continued to exert enormous power in Kansas City with corruption at multiple levels, including control of the police department, widespread gambling and prostitution, and wide-open entertainment venues. In 1932, a women's organization called the Government Study Club was the audience for an unexpected assault on the Pendergast regime by Rabbi Samuel Meyerberg. The women heard Meyerberg exhort them, quote, "You've turned your city over to a gang and given it into the hands of crooks and racketeers because you are asleep. The time has come for action. The time for study is past." In his autobiography, Meyerberg later commented, the reception given that address amazed me. Those gentle women, leaders in the club life of the city, arose and shouted their approval. A growing recognition of the corruption of the Pendergast machine forces became apparent as the 1930s progressed. As a result, reform efforts became more organized. Rabbi Meyerberg was instrumental in the development of the Charter League, followed by the Citizens Fusion ticket in 1934. An increasingly popular concept promoted in these reform efforts was nonpartisan government, designed to replace the heavily partisan and contentious politics then being practiced in Kansas City. At the same time that there were multiple organizational efforts to combat the rampant corruption in Kansas City's city and county governments, there were also individual reform efforts afoot. One of the most well-known reformers in the mid-1930s was Edith Dalby, wife of Reverend Albert Dalby, pastor of Broadway Baptist Church. Long an activist in previous communities and a licensed minister herself, Edith became so enraged about the widespread corruption in the city, she began to speak out with passion about the need to boycott all places of business that operated gambling devices. Her outspoken message captured the attention of the Executive Committee of the Council of Churches and the Ministerial Alliance, and she subsequently led a delegation of women representing the PTA and women's clubs to lobby for reform at City Hall. Although well-intentioned and even courageous in her efforts, Mrs. Dalby began to experience fierce resistance to her message. She and her husband received threatening anonymous phone calls and even visits to their home by strangers threatening their lives and the lives of their children. The situation became so frightening that Mrs. Dalby backed off from her public statements, and fearing continuing danger, she and her family left town for a lengthy period of time. Although both Rabbi Meyerberg and Edith Dalby were unsuccessful in their individual efforts to substantially thwart the machine's grip on the city, they did signify the gradual recognition on the part of Kansas City's civic leadership that a concerted community-wide initiative would be necessary to end the Pendergast machine era. The challenge to do so was complex and intimidating. As described in a Holiday magazine feature, Kansas City had become, quote, a rollicking haven of gangsters, gamblers, con men, striptease dancers, traveling salesmen, cattlemen, and conventioneers. Clip joints, flesh pots, and homicides flourished. In the burlesque shows, even G-strings were I practiced this morning, were superfluous. Votes were stolen by the handful, and voting lists were padded with names taken from tombstones. I'm going to stop here a minute because I want to share with you a Cronkite family story. As some of you know, my maiden name was Cronkite, and Walter Cronkite was my cousin. His father and my father were brothers. So I was very fortunate to have the opportunity when I was growing up to be around Walter some as he was becoming increasingly popular on the national and international stage, in addition to having the chance to be with him in those later years when we had some great times together. So often he loved to tell this true story. When he was a cub reporter and had just come to Kansas City to join one of the papers, not the Kansas City Star, he had been on the job only a few weeks, and it was a local election day. So he wanted to be sure to vote before he went into work, so he did. So about half an hour later, he went into work, and he was there sitting at the desk beginning to work on a story. And his boss came up to him and said, "Walter, we need you to go vote." And Walter said, "Well, I already voted." And his boss said, "No, we need you to vote again." So he handed him a little slip of paper with a name on it, and he said, "Just go outside and there'll be a police officer there, and he will take you in his police car to a different polling place. Use this name, and you know how to vote." So Walter did not want to lose his brand new job, so he went outside. There was a police officer, took him to a different polling place, and he voted. So he came back to work, and he'd been there about an hour, and his boss came up to him and said, "Walter, we need you to go vote." And Walter said, "Well, I've already voted twice." And he said, "Well, we need you to vote again." Handed him a slip of paper, different name, said, "Go out, there'll be a different police officer. He will take you to a different polling place, and you know how to vote." So as I said, Walter loved to tell the story to all of his famous friends about how I voted 3 times in one election. That's one example of what was multiplied how many times during those years. So the issues were real. We have true documentation of that. And although this reality was more than distasteful to most Kansas Cityans, ambivalence still existed among many. A leading newspaper at the time editorialized that an open city brought tourism and thus increased financial viability for the community. As described by one Civic observer, quote, "It was difficult for Southsiders," and by the way, if you were a Southsider, you lived south of 31st Street, "to understand the magnitude of the problem as they lived in a part of the city not directly encountering daily corruption." An apt description of the ambivalent attitude toward Pendergast and his machine was reflected in the words of Maurice Milligan, former U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Missouri, when he wrote, quote, "I think it can be said without exaggeration that the people of Kansas City accepted Pendergast as the visible symbol of their pragmatic philosophy of live and let live. They took a certain amount of pride in him." There was also continuing fear among many in the city, fear for their physical safety and also their financial livelihoods. As one researcher described, quote, "People were told what physicians they might use, what lawyers might practice, what merchants might do business. Personnel men would refuse to employ men unless they had passes from the boss. All city insurance and all surety bonds for contractors working for the city or county had to be negotiated through one insurance broker. Respectable businessmen soon found it a matter of safety to have Pendergast or Judge McElroy, Tom's henchman and city manager, identified with them in their concerns. In some instances, they received blocks of stocks. In others, they were paid for serving on executive boards. In spite of the seeming intransigence of the Pendergast machine, by 1938, there were rapidly developing internal and external stresses. Multiple reform forces worked to implode the Pendergast dynasty. Governor Stark, working with Democrats statewide, began to mobilize to thwart Pendergast's efforts to control state government. A particularly important action by Stark was to appoint new members of the Kansas City Board of Elections, individuals who were not under the thumb of the machine. In Jackson County, a judicial investigation of machine activities were underway, and fraud and tax evasion charges against Pendergast by the federal government were proceeding under the leadership of Maurice Milligan. As a result, there was increasing awareness among the general citizenry of corruption at City Hall. A compelling example was the realization that the city had a deficit of over $1.5 million in the general operating fund, which ultimately led to no salaries for city employees being paid the last 4 months of 1939. And after the 1940 election, it was learned that the city's actual debt was $11 million. That's a lot of money in 1940. Heated encounters between Pendergast forces and individual citizens were on the increase. You'll love this one. A particular graphic example occurred at City Hall. The wife of a city fireman called on Judge McElroy to protest his actions in cutting the wages and breaking up the union of the firemen. Armed with a leather whip, she was swinging lustily on the judge. That's a quote. When his attendants went to the rescue, they attempted to explain the woman's actions by charging that she was intoxicated. And she admitted that she had had a nickel beer, which was all she could afford on her husband's salary of $67 a month. Finally, in rapid succession, Pendergast was indicted on April 7, 1939. McElroy resigned as city manager on April 13th, and anti-machine reform efforts began to coalesce. A succession of organizations were formed, including the Charter Party. Its focus was a petition drive to force an election to recall the machine-controlled mayor and city council. Months of hard work by hundreds of volunteers resulted in over 100,000 persons being named on the recall petitions. Those were submitted to the city clerk for validation to enable a special city election. Well, guess what? The remnants of the Pendergast machine still controlled City Hall, including the city clerk's office. Behind closed doors, the clerk and his staff circulated among themselves a list of 20 questionable factors which could disqualify a signer of the petition. As a result, the city clerk struck over 55,000 names from the list. Remaining were only 42,000, which was an inadequate number to warrant a recall election. Predictably, the citizens were outraged, and this episode lent much credibility to the efforts of the reformers to galvanize the community. So the reform leaders went back to the drawing board, recognizing that initiative petitions were approved by the Board of Elections rather than the city clerk. As a result, a campaign was launched for a charter change that would reduce from 4 years to 2 the terms of office for the mayor and city council, including the current machine mayor and council. Occurring during this same general time period when the reform efforts were gaining momentum, there was a related episode in which women played a prominent role. It energized women throughout the city as they observed the issue unfold. 3 women, active in the leadership of the Women's Forward Kansas City Committee, a fledgling reform group, were selected by the presiding judge of the Jackson County Court to serve as an advisory committee to examine the county's institutions. The 3 women named were Mrs. Charles N. Seidlitz Jr., Mrs. William E. Kemp, and Mrs. J. Howard Stevenson. For 6 months, the 3 women spent countless volunteer hours assessing county departments, uncovering evidence of poor management and inadequate services being provided in county facilities. Then, abruptly, with no advance warning, the other 2 judges, the 2 machine judges of the county court, disarmed and dismantled the Women's Advisory Committee. In other words, they were fired from their positions. So this well-publicized episode served as an example to Kansas City women of the typical mindset of the machine politicians, even county judges. The reaction in women's organizations was illustrated by the action of the Kansas City Athenaeum as their 500 members endorsed a resolution chastising the two judges for disbanding the Women's Advisory Group. The convergence of this rejection of the women by the county court with the rapidly developing involvement of women in the city's reform groups further energized all of the women to become civic activists. And so from that point on, in dizzying progression, more reform organizations were created, including the Anti-Machine Democratic Citizens Association, the United Democratic Committee, and the United Citizens Committee. One of the most visible and progressive groups was that fledgling Forward Kansas City. Made up of many prominent business leaders, it was the first time this segment of the community had become visible in anti-machine activities. An executive committee of Forward Kansas City was quickly formed with 3 women among those appointed to serve. The women were again Mrs. Charles N. Seidlitz, plus Mrs. Edmund Field and Mrs. Charles S. Petrot. Because of the continuing outrage over the rejection of the recall petitions at City Hall, and with the leadership of Forward Kansas City, that new approach, the initiative petition, gained momentum. It was recognized that if the drive was successful and the subsequent charter change resulted in reducing from 4 years to 2 the terms for mayor and city council, a second election would be required. So the subsequent strategy was threefold. Get enough signatures on the charter change petitions, be successful in an election to get the term reduction, and shortly thereafter elect a reform-minded mayor and city council. The first election date was projected to be February 13th, 1940, and if successful, the second election would be held 7 weeks later on April 2nd. So, during the fall of 1939, as momentum built among the various reform-oriented groups, it became abundantly clear that there needed to be a single organization formed to lead the campaign efforts, thus the creation of the United Campaign Committee, including the other committees that I have named, and then shortly thereafter, the Women's City Club and the League of Women Voters formally joined the effort. Typical of the mindset of increasing numbers of Kansas City women were the comments of Mrs. Susie Robinson, a volunteer with the emerging United Campaign Committee. She said, quote, "We women have been ashamed of our city too long. We've apologized for it to our young people too much. The time is here for a thorough house cleaning at City Hall. Women who use their home and tea and bridge parties as an excuse to shirk their civic responsibilities are placing an added burden on the rest of us who do want a fine city in which to live." So regardless of the gender boundaries that existed at the time, and they were there was early recognition that women needed to be actively involved in the anticipated 1940 campaigns. So a women's division of the United Campaign Committee was created. And in November, in 1939, under the campaign slogan of ballots and brooms versus bosses and bullets, the initial meeting of the Women's Division was held. Representatives of organizations made up of over 10,000 women were in attendance. Topics of discussion at the meeting included the announcement of a poster and cartoon contest to illustrate the political situation in Kansas City. Also discussed were plans to schedule large numbers of informational meetings throughout the city regarding the need for reform. The sponsoring organization, the League of Women Voters, would provide the training for the women serving on the speaking panels at those informational meetings. Perhaps the most important decision announced that day was the selection of Mrs. George Gorton, known as Claude, as chairman of the Women's Division. She would prove to be the linchpin for the entire campaign effort. From the beginning of the women's campaign activities, there was a recognition that one of the challenges was to assure other women that it was safe to vote for reform, in that the voting process would be legal and confidential. As Mrs. Conger Smith, an active Republican in the campaign, stated, quote, "Confidence must be built up in the minds of women. Confidence that their ballots are secret and that they will be counted. If we lose 10 votes in each precinct through fear, we have lost 4,000 votes. Education that overcomes fear will hold those 4,000 votes." One of the first major efforts led by the Women's Division was registering voters throughout the city for the initiative petition drive. So, how did they do it? Going door to door, hundreds of women contacted individuals to be sure they were registered and also prepared to vote on the two projected election days. Again, February 13th and April 2nd. After unregistered voters were identified, other women would drive them to the Board of Election offices to officially register. Over 200 cars were used in that effort. A third group of women were telephoning citizens around the city to also identify individuals and make arrangements for the registration process. An agreement was reached with the Kansas City Star, which, by the way, was very supportive of this reform effort, to print in their newspapers a form which citizens could fill out and mail in to the election board, identifying the new addresses. After being received and processed, the women volunteers would prepare and mail postcards acknowledging that those citizens were now eligible to vote. In later reflecting on her active role in the women's campaign efforts, Mrs. John Gage, the future mayor's wife, described a frantic pace. She was in charge of the postal card effort, including the registration notification and subsequent reminders to vote. According to Mrs. Gage, 109,000 postcards were sent in the course of the campaign. She described a massive addressing effort, remember, all by hand, with hundreds of women involved in this single aspect of the campaign. Also sponsored by the Women's Division, a weekly slogan contest was underway. Over 300 women typically voted in the selection process, and $5 was the prize. One winning slogan was offered by Miss Alma Bates, and I quote, "The old machine is out of fix. We now are wise to all their tricks. Our women brave with eyes so keen will help keep Kansas City clean." A more succinct entry in the contest was offered by Mr. C.H. Huffman, quote, "Kansas City's dirty dishes are in the sink, while most of the bosses are in the clink." Chosen as the overall symbol of the 1940 reform efforts was the broom. Lapel pins were designed consisting of a miniature broom with a blue handle and red ribbons. Mr. William Munger, husband of one of the women active in the reform effort, made the broom pins in his basement, and they were sold for $1 each to raise funds for the United Campaign and the subsequent development of the Citizens Association. There was even a theme song for the reform campaign entitled "God Bless Our Town." It had new lyrics for an old favorite, "God Bless America." and was sung at many campaign events. In January of 1940, it became apparent that the efforts of the United Campaign and its most active participants, the Women's Division, were succeeding. The end result of all of that telephoning, going door to door, sending postcards, and participating in speaking events resulted in over 100,000 citizens signing the initiative petitions, the Board of Election Commissioners certifying the petitions, and the election day formally set for February 13th. On that February 13th election day, a huge volunteer effort was evident. Thousands of women were active in getting citizens to the polls. 500 had been assigned to be on the phones all day, encouraging voter turnout, while 500 more were in their cars, driving voters to and from the polls. Also, at every precinct across the city, women were assigned to provide all-day oversight and support. There was an additional group of over 100 women preparing meals for the election judges in every precinct. In total, over 7,500 women were involved as volunteers on that election day. And it was reported that, quote, at the polls, the women workers for the United Campaign outnumbered the men workers 3-1. A 5-1 majority vote in favor of the charter change set the stage for the April 2nd city election of the mayor, the new mayor, and city council. It had been a massive victory for anti-machine supporters across the city. And in February 14th, Valentine's Day, did the women celebrate? The day following the election, over 1,500 women gathered at the United Campaign headquarters. Women's Division Chairman Claude Gorton led the gala by announcing that tea would not be served. Instead, it's going to be punch, fruit punch with a brass band. A cakewalk ensued with the band playing Happy Days Are Here Again, followed by Roll Out the Barrel, with singing, hugs, and more flowers arriving at the scene all day long. One joyful male supporter told Mrs. Gorton that, quote, I've just been to City Hall. They've got the flag and the pigeons all at half-mast. And Mrs. Gorton asserted, the women have been marvelous all day long. They have marched to the polls just as we knew they would. They worked shoulder to shoulder with the men. I toured every ward in the city today, and I saw what the women did. One of the volunteers in the slogan contest, in fact, a winner, had been selected by the Women's Division as the motto for the entire reform campaign, a new heart for the heart of America. It was proudly displayed on a large red heart at the campaign headquarters, and when victory in the February election was assured, the heart, over 6 feet across, was moved to the front window for all to see. So, following that February 13th victory, the reform campaign transitioned quickly into implementation of a game plan for the April 2nd election for mayor and city council. Again, under the leadership of Mrs. Gorton, women mobilized into telephone, transportation, and other committees to support the reform ticket, even as the ticket was being assembled. Recognition of the women's commitment to the reform efforts spread throughout the city, and on that April election day, as men seasoned in election day activities reported, quote, the men were doing nothing in the 11th precinct of the 7th ward. The women were getting out darn near the whole vote, and it's a good big vote, too. Another man then described that, quote, he had 17 women just in his precinct, driving cars, telephoning, and passing out cards to procrastinators. Another male poll worker noted that, quote, there were 12 women doing their bit, and they've been up since dawn, telephoning and driving, and they don't even stop to eat. I've watched them, and I don't know of one of them that's taken off for lunch. And in the 8th ward, a male observer commented, quote, the biggest part of the vote we've got so far have been cast by women. The women aren't only working, they're voting. Women that never voted before in their lives have come in here today and voted. So, Election Day on April 2nd, 1940, did produce a record turnout and an overwhelming victory for the anti-machine reformers. Their candidate, John Gage, was elected mayor, and all but one of the reformers' slate of city council candidates were elected. Again, the celebrations began. Governor Stark personally congratulated the women in a telegram to Claude Gorton. He said, "All Missouri is proud of the part the women of Kansas City played in cleaning up the wreckage left by years of Pendergast misrule. No one ever again can question the powerful influence of women voters for honest, efficient government. I am confident that the brooms which made Kansas City a clean community in yesterday's election will keep it clean in the years to come." And finally, of the thousands of women volunteers who devoted time, energy, and resources to the reform campaign of 1940, one woman was acknowledged by all as their singular leader. Claude Gorton, the designated chair of the Women's Division of the United Campaign Committee, exhibited exemplary leadership in that role. She's been given much of the credit for the 1940 victories. In addition to her organizational skills, Claude Gorton traversed the city from one end to the other during the campaigns, taking every opportunity to speak to women's clubs, neighborhood groups, and civic organizations. As commented on by many, she seemed to relate to all groups of citizens, no matter how diverse. Recollections include her campaigning, quote, "down in the Italian neighborhoods and the Negro districts and over in the West Side community meetings. In each case, she impressed her audience with her warmth and intelligence." She was also not afraid to confront anyone in the audience who challenged her in a personal way. One instance occurred when a machine politician interrupted her speech. She recognized him and recalled that he'd referred to the women involved in the reform movement as, quote, pink-nailed, cocktail-drinking, cigar-smoking Southsiders. She took this opportunity to chastise him for his comments and assure him that she was a true Alabama Democrat. At another campaign appearance, Mrs. Gorton began to pull off her elegant elbow-length gloves, then commented, quote, "I want to get these gloves off first," she explained with her slow and gentle smile. "The men say you can hit a lot harder with hard fists." On Election Day, it was reported that Claude Gorton arrived at campaign headquarters when the sun rose. She voted early that day, once, and spent the following hours visiting every ward in the city to check on the work of the women on the ballot. When the campaign was over, Mrs. Gorton reflected back on the decisive role of women in achieving victory in both elections. She said, thoroughly aroused at the broken machine promises and definitely determined to clean house, the women voters of Kansas City showed their real fighting spirit. Our broom was no idle symbol, as machine workers like to say. It never is. We women were determined more than ever that we would clean house. We decided that something must be done. We did not break faith with those who blazed the trail in founding our great city. The true spirit of the pioneer mother predominated. 25 years after the 1940 Reform Campaign, a veteran political reporter reflected on Claude Gorton's leadership. He wrote, "If she had been a man, she'd have been president." So, a rich and enlightened period in Kansas City has passed. However, the reforms instituted by Claude Gorton and thousands of other women and men still resonate in this city today. Valuable lessons have been learned, and the legacy of the 1940 elections remain. It was a noble experiment and it succeeded. Thank you. You know what time it is? What time is it? Just checking the time. Okay. We've got just a few minutes.
I have the microphone here. Since this is being recorded, if you could raise your hand, and I'll get you the microphone so you can be recorded for forever.
Yes, John.
Kay, when can we expect you to run for president?
Oh my gosh.
I can guarantee you we can get the people in the audience to vote as many times as it takes.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Lucinda's also available over there with the microphone.
I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of Johnson County, by the way. I noticed the first half, a little more than the first half, you never mentioned a woman by her own name. It was always Mrs. and the husband's name. That finally got changed. Thank you.
Well, that's reflective, as you would know, of that particular time. And in fact, I think it might have been difficult in a couple of instances to have tracked down the first name of the women, which is regrettable, and I'm very glad that now we are not dealing with that reality. But certainly at that time, as many of us know, that was the state of affairs. Any other questions?
I'll ask one, Kay, and
Yes.
that is, you mentioned Governor Stark and his telegram after the victory. Any word from Harry Truman during this entire campaign?
I am not recalling, certainly in the specific research I was doing, mention of him in the context of the reform movement. I do recall reading that he was, in a sense, in a political bind because of his past close relationship with Pendergast, and on the other hand, his growing recognition of the problematic issues that were emerging not only in the city but in the state. So I think it's fair to say that he was going through a transition himself, and certainly at some point later on, I think fully understood why the reform effort was needed.
I might tell you the other side of your cousin's voting. My father was an election judge who was either 34 or 36, and someone came in and gave a name and address, and Dad asked for the address again and said, "We need to, that's a 6-room, single-family house, and I live there too. We need to get acquainted."
That's great.
We have a question here.
There was an attorney named Leon Look who did some work for Tom Pendergast. My parents bought the Pendergast silver flatware, sterling flatware from him. It's a 93-piece set, and it has the Pendergast initial on it. And if anybody's interested, silver has an antibacterial property. So if you were to buy it, I don't think you would catch any of Pendergast's diseases.
That's great. That's great. Thank you.
Although the Missouri Valley Room isn't really interested in Pendergast silver, if anyone has one of those little broom lapel pins in your knick-knack shelf, we might be interested in that.
I just want to remind everybody to honor these women who worked so hard, and make sure you get out there and vote August 5th.
Yes.
Yes, your presentation this afternoon was very enlightening. And I learned a lot of things that I had no idea about, learned women's names that I've not heard of before. My partner and I were mentioning that some of these individuals who are so important, we don't see their names anywhere. And I think that's sad to have happened. I appreciate all of the research that you're currently doing, and my question is, are you going to continue researching women's involvement politically in Kansas City and things that they have done here to, again, enlighten us of the kinds of contributions that women have made in Kansas City.
Well, thank you for asking that. And I was involved after I completed this paper doing a second research paper for the second course I took at KU, and I called it Refined Rebels, and it's a paper contrasting Sarah Coates, the wife of Kersey Coates, who was a remarkable woman and really the first female leader and activist in Kansas City, beginning in the 1850s all the way through the 1880s, comparing her with Sarah Robinson in Lawrence, the wife of the first governor of Kansas. And that was a fascinating experience to do the research on those two women. So if I take a little vacation, then I think I would like to go back in and do more research, because there's so much more that we can all learn. One more?
Hey, how much of the story that you just told is unique to Kansas City versus maybe a more national kind of a sweeping movement that was going on at the same time? Just curious.
I wish I could answer that with any degree of specificity. I am not able to, because I really focused only on Kansas City. I think it is fair to say that Kansas City during the 1930s had the reputation around the country of being the most wide open, wildest, out of control, great and worst place to be, depending on your perspective. So I think that is fair to say. I am sure, though, there are other communities where there were reform efforts of one kind or another occurring. Thank you all. You've been great.